You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
To be back from vacation and back behind the golden Dixie Heritage microphone. Our guest this week is Mark C. Atkins. Mark is a former Marine veteran who served during the 80s, and now he is the author of the book Women in Combat, Immoral, Foolish, and Unnatural. And he's our guest today. Mark is in Italy right now. In fact, he's been in Italy for the last several weeks, and we've been putting off recording an interview because he's in Italy and his business there has kept him a little longer than he had intended. And so we just decided that we were going to do the interview by long distance. It's been a little perilous, and by perilous I mean we've had some difficulty pulling it off. He started out in his hotel room, and we had a couple of disconnections, and you'll see them here as we go on with the interview. And so finally he went outside. He went to the roof of his hotel, and we were able to finish the interview on the roof of the hotel. The problem with that was it was very windy up there, and so the wind creates some interference at times. And also we went from a Wi-Fi signal to a cellular signal, and the cell signals in Italy just aren't as the cellular network in Europe just isn't as good as it is here in the United States. And so we had some bandwidth issues and some other things there. You will notice that during the interview, but still you'll want to stay tuned. It's a great conversation with Mark C. Atkins, author of the book Women in Combat. On the cover of the book, you describe yourself as a failed Marine. What did you mean by that?
Well, the first question everybody asks is, Mark, do you have any combat experience? And that's understandable. That is, do I have any experiential authority? Well, the answer is no, I don't. As a matter of fact, I have anti-moral authority in that 30-something years ago, in 1986, I served briefly in the Marine Corps and face planted badly. I was 19 years old and a little bit broken, and I hit the bottom hard and began my long journey of growing up the hard way. So I just throw that out there, put it on the cover itself, so I don't have anything to hide. My discharge was technically honorable, but there was nothing honorable about it. It was disgraceful. It was an embarrassment. But people, the next thing they asked me is, we don't have any combat experience. Are you an expert on anything related to combat? And my answer to that is absolutely not. I might be an expert carving gouge commissioner. I'm very good at that, but that has nothing to do with combat. If you don't have, and people want you to have, if you're going to speak on a topic, they want you to have some experience or some expertise, which I have none. So the question is, Mark, what are you doing? Why are you writing on this topic? Well, I'm speaking on this topic because it's extremely important, it's consequential, and it's not being discussed as it should be by experts or those with experience or those in the military, and certainly not by the media. So what authority am I speaking? Well, I'm speaking on the same authority as that of the little boy who cried, "The emperor has no clothes." I'm simply pointing out the obvious.
And so it's obvious that there's an agenda. But why do you think it is that the media and certain people in our political structure have this agenda?
Well, in my book, I attempt to get to the root of the matter. The agenda is born of, let's say, thousands of years of history. More recently, something happened in, let's say, the 1700s. And it was born of something that happened in the 1600s. Namely, we're talking about the scientific revolution, which radically expanded our knowledge of the world. And this historic event gave birth to what I call twins, one physical, one mental. It gave birth to the Industrial Revolution, and it gave birth to the Enlightenment. The Industrial Revolution has, since in the last 300 years, has radically transformed the way human beings live. And it has allowed human beings to ask some questions that our ancestors were never able to ask before. And this is where the Enlightenment comes into play. We can manipulate the world and make it more productive and become more prosperous. Well, why can't we fix mankind? And thus was born a new religion. We'll call it progressivism. And progressivism gave birth to all kinds of little sects, we'll call them isms, ideologies, communism, socialism, capitalism, libertarianism, and the evilest of all, feminism. These ideas are all based upon a few leaps of faith that our ancestors back in the 1700s, I'm painting with a very broad brush. Historians will forgive me. But our ancestors back in let's say the 1700s began to take some new leaps of faith. I mean, if you're a Christian, what is your leap of faith? Well, it's that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. It's unprovable. But there is a God. It's pretty solid rationale for the existence of a God. But that if Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that's the leap of faith. And it's unavoidable. You have to either take it or you don't. Well, the new progressive, this new religion, they took their own leaps of faith. The belief in the supremacy of the individual, of freedom and equality. And they've embraced these ideas with childlike faith. And these ideas that we are born free or born equal, they've embraced. They're not to be questioned. They're simply sovereign truths. Man is manifestly not born free. He's manifestly not born equal. What the progressives mean is that, well, he ought to be free. He ought to be equal. And the word ought is a word with a lot of religious meaning. You know, we Christians say, well, we ought to do what Jesus says. We ought to be good. We ought not to be bad. Well, the progressive says, well, you ought to be free. You ought to be equal. It's not based upon anything reasonable. It's not based upon anything rational. And you can't be free and equal at the same time. Where there's freedom, there's no equality. Where there's equality, there's no freedom. But they're childlike, the progressive childlike embracing of these ideas, notions, has led to some absurdities such as communism, some very bad ideas such as socialism, some of the evil ideas such as Nazism. These ideas that we and the worst of all, I declare, feminism.
I don't necessarily mean to interrupt you here, but you had mentioned Marxism, specifically communism, Nazism. I know Adolf Hitler had a very strict policy of not putting women in combat. So I know that at least that was not the Nazi ideal. And I don't even think that the Russians have ever had a problem with women in combat. So why is it that American Marxism has this agenda? Because it seems unique to our version of Marxism.
Sure. And again, I've got to apologize. I always feel this need to qualify my comments. I paint with a broad brush. I'm not a historian. I'm not a scholar. I don't claim to be. But I do try to see the big pieces. Whatever American progressivism is all, or communism and Nazism, feminism, they all stem from the Enlightenment. So it's all coming from the same tree, just another branch of the same tree. It's all based upon, one form or another, a belief in equality and or freedom. Okay, let's take what is driving this particular issue today. It has been for decades. Is a feminist ideology that has declared that women are the same as men, or that women ought to be the same as men. They ought to be the equal of man. And for that matter, man ought to be the equal of woman. That's why I'm here right now. Now, it's manifestly absurd. You have disappeared. So I'm waiting for it to reconnect. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, I can hear you.
And we've lost our guest. Not to worry, we will get him back. While I'm in the process of doing that, I'm going to go ahead and insert a commercial here for our sponsor, the Barnes Review. If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. We didn't have audio the couple times we connected, and I tried to phone call you. That didn't work. I tried to audio-only FaceTime. Sometimes that uses less internet bandwidth, but...
The problem was on my side. For some reason, I completely lost the signal. I turned off my phone and turned it back on.
Okay. You were saying how Marxism and other isms have come out of the Enlightenment and feminism out of the Enlightenment, and
all these isms, all these ideas, these notions that our ancestors began embracing generations ago, they all stem from the same leaps of faith, the worship of the individual, the worship of equality, the worship of freedom. And they've produced absurd ideas such as feminism. And then feminism itself has produced some terrible ideas, evil ideas such as abortion. It has given us the divorce culture. Feminism is the major contributor to the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, to the promiscuity culture, the culture of illegitimacy, and now it's giving us the dumbest idea of all time, that is institutionalizing women in combat. The problem with all these terrible ideas about freedom and equality have given us all these terrible wars, horrific wars. Feminism has produced this modern post-1960s, post-cultural revolution world in which we live. Feminism, we all look around every day and we see just we see societal ills. Okay, we see dysfunction. We see problems in society. And not that there's never been problems before, of course there always have been. But we recognize something has gone seriously wrong since the 1960s. And feminism is one of the major contributors to the manifest dysfunction in our society today, because feminism is striving to remake basic humanity. I declare that feminism is vastly worse than communism or Nazism.
Again, we've lost our guest, and it's also early in the show, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stick our second commercial in here for the American Free Press, and while you're listening to that, I'll be getting our guest back, and then hopefully we'll be able to talk for the remainder of the hour without having to interrupt. If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Hey,
You're outside now.
well, I'm in a big stone building, and so I've moved outside where hopefully the cell signal will be better, and this will solve the problem.
Okay.
I hope I can hardly see the screen, but that's okay. There's a sun.
There
There we go.
you go. That seems to be a better. You don't have the sun in the background now.
There we go. We'll try this. Where did I get to? Do you know?
Well, let me go ahead and put out a question then.
Sure.
Because you were talking about feminism.
Yeah.
And I'm going to guess then that feminism did not take root in Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia like it did in the United States. And that's part of the problem we have in this country.
Well, I mean, every country is different. Every time period is different. I mean, the communists, and I think they embraced it wholeheartedly, or they embraced the idea that women and men ought to be the same, ought to be equal. That's at the bedrock of their faith. Of course, the Nazis, they're altogether different. No, they weren't going to put women in combat. They had a more rational view of man's nature and woman's nature. Hardly excuses what they did and what they believed. But the United States, there's something about the U.S. feminism that is more virulent than other forms that I've observed. I mean, feminism has spread wherever Enlightenment ideology has spread. Okay, the driving force behind feminism is an inborn is within the nature of woman and man themselves. Woman has always had a very understandable sense of resentment towards man. There's always been this conflict between man and woman since the beginning of time, and it will always exist. Feminism rose in the 1800s, not because it was a new idea. Not because the women didn't have an old gripe, they did, but it rose because it could. The Industrial Revolution allowed it to rise. It spread wherever industrialism has spread, wherever Enlightenment ideas have spread, it's gone with it. But it's different in Latin America. It's not as, I'll say, virulent down there as it is in the United States. The reason it's so virulent in the United States, the great root goes straight back to the Puritans of New England. Not that they themselves were ever conceived of that feminism would be what it is today, but it's their cultural descendants that are the radicals.
Chapters 1, 2, and 3, I think we've kind of discussed in our last few minutes of conversation. But then in chapter 4, you talk about how we live in the perfect time for this feminist ideal of women in combat to seem plausible.
Yeah, and let's be clear about this. Men and women are manifestly different across the board. They are as different as they are alike. They have their respective natures, and it's obvious what they are. They are complementary. Feminism has been striving relentlessly to eliminate all distinctions between men and women. Some are kind of a little bit laudable. Giving women protection before the law, increasing their property rights, and that sort of thing. That's somewhat praiseworthy. It's like they're not because these are religious fanatics, basically. They're never going to be satisfied until they've crossed the Jordan. And that means all distinctions are eliminated. Now, it's one thing to give woman the same property rights, or the same rights before the law as we give man. That's one thing. Okay, but to say that she is the same as man in combat, well, that's absurd. Okay, combat is an extension of man's unique masculine nature. That's just the nature of things. Combat is of man. Okay, and what they're going to do is, and what has happened now is that they have this opportunity. There's like a window of time is opened where they have this opportunity to present this absurdity as something that is plausible. All right. Well, I mean, and one thing they do is they're going to find the exceptions. They've got women in uniform in large numbers now. They've gotten women in combat, particularly in Afghanistan and Iraq. Okay, they have examples now of women performing well, some women performing well in these terrible circumstances. All right, what these circumstances are that they give, these are like the islands in the Pacific Ocean. Well, yes, there are dry points in the Pacific Ocean, thousands of little islands. Okay, but that doesn't mean the ocean's dry; it's still wet. Okay, and so what they're trying to lead the debate by pointing out the exceptions. There are some exceptionally tough, masculinized women out there that have performed well. There's no question about that, and they've performed well in combat since the beginning of time. This is nothing new, but all piled up together, and multiplied times 100. It's a mound about as tall as I am, about 6 foot tall. That's a mound of examples as tall as I am, next to Mount Everest. Right. Mount Everest of examples of men in combat. Okay.
Right. Well, every generation, I'm sure, has had its Joan of Arc, but that doesn't mean that I would say 95% of women in the world are Joan of Arc type women.
Oh, there's not 1/10 of 1% that are that type. The examples are rare. I mean, we could not recruit a full strength company of infantry, all female infantry, in the United States. There's not enough women, and we would never deploy it. Not in a true high intensity combat situation. It had to be a very controlled environment, which we would ever deploy such a unit. And we have 300+ million people in this country. All right. So the exceptions is one of they're banking on the exceptions, producing a believable, something plausible, something that's plausible, something that's believable, because it's just they know they can't eliminate all the distinction between men and women. It's just physically impossible. Women are always going to give birth to babies. That can't be changed. Okay. Right. So in the meantime, what the feminists will be satisfied with is an illusion, as long as everybody agrees that they're the same. And then maybe if we can all agree for long enough that they are the same, maybe that somehow will produce some sort of future reality that they are indeed the same. It's absurd. The other great window that is opened is all born of just economic circumstances and technology. The United States right now, since World War II in particular, especially since Vietnam and the fall of the Soviet Union, then we're enjoying a rare military supremacy, one that's almost without precedent. I mean, there have been empires in the past that have dominated militarily their whole sphere. Okay, and Great Britain certainly dominated to a remarkable extent around the globe, but there were still major powers that could go toe to toe with Great Britain. Germany, for example, of World War I. Right now, we're untouchable. Well, our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq simply cannot be compared. Can't be compared to Vietnam. All right. As far as brutality and the scale of the brutality and intensity, the number of casualties, the requirements made upon so many soldiers to physically, emotionally, mentally exert themselves to the extreme. We have technology has allowed us to keep our enemies at arm's length. At arm's length, our casualties are very minuscule. The exertion required by deployment is nothing compared to what it was even in World War I, or certainly prior to World War I and prior to the train. Soldiers used to, even in World War II, the German soldier, he basically walked to Stalingrad, and if he lived, he walked back. All right. Well, this is not the case for American soldiers today. We're flown everywhere. We're flown right on top of our enemies. And we can hit them, they can't hit us. So this has given feminism a remarkable opportunity to put women in combat, and where many have been killed and some horribly wounded, but enough have survived and performed admirably that they're able to say, look, women are the equal of man in combat. But what they're doing is they're simply ignoring thousands of years of history and basic human nature.
But
Okay, well,
elaborate on that. How is the nature of women materially different from that of men?
well, first of all, I'm not going to say anything that everybody in your audience certainly doesn't already know. Again, I'm pointing out the obvious. All right. Man has a nature that inclines him to do certain things. He's inclined to take a woman, to have children with her, to adore his children, to sacrifice himself for them and for her, and to provide for her and to protect her and their children. He's simply inclined to do that. Not that all men always have. Of course they have it, but that is an inclination. It's a powerful inclination. He is inclined to make war on his fellow man. He's inclined to form groups. We'll call them tribes or city-states or nations or whatever you want to call them. He's inclined to unite himself with other men under the leadership of some captain of some sort or another, king, lord, chieftain, whatever. And then under the leadership of this captain, the men of the tribe, they band together and they defend the whole tribe. That's the way it's always been. No matter how small the group is, that's the way it is. And they're inclined often under the leadership of some captain to sally forth to take that which belongs to other tribes. This is war. War 101. It's always been this way, will always be this way. Men who don't coalesce into groups under the leadership of some captain will be killed by other men that have or made slaves. That's just the nature of things. All right. Woman, on the other hand, is inclined to have a man. Okay, and when they are joined together, we call this man, this woman, husband and wife. We call their union marriage. Marriage is a natural union born of our DNA. It's not a social construction, and it is a union between a man and a woman. That's what it is. It's not subject to redefinition. And then this woman is inclined to make a home, a thatched hut, a brick 3-bedroom ranch, or whatever it may be. But she wants to make this home, and she dwells within this home and around this home. This home is the center of her world. This is where she keeps her stuff. This is where she makes the stuff that she makes. It's where she tends the elderly and teaches the young. And it's where they sleep. It's where he comes home to. This home is very important to her, and she makes it. Okay, home is not where the heart is. Home is where the woman is. Wherever your woman is, it could be a hotel room. It could be a shack. It could be a castle. That's home. She's what makes the house a home. She makes home. Home is an extension of woman. Home is every bit as needful as it is for man to work. Man must go forth from home, out to his shop, out to his field, out to the woods, to the factory in these days, and produce what he can in order to provide for his wife, children, for their home. This is human nature 101. It's been this way since Adam said goodbye to Eve when he left her behind in the cave and he went forth to hunt. So this home is as needful, and it's her contribution to the success of the race. It's how we survive. It's immensely critical. Now, look at feminism's view of home. Look at feminism's view of the homemaker. The housewife. All right. Feminism, besides trying to make woman into a combat soldier, has done all that it possibly can to denigrate, to debase the homemaker, to denigrate woman's principal product in this life. Not that she doesn't do other things or doesn't have an identity outside of her home, but it's the principal product of her life. Just as the principal work of a man's life is to protect and provide for his family. He does many other things, but first, protect and provide. That's the base of the matter. But feminism has worked tirelessly to denigrate home. So on two fronts, feminism is working to destroy the home. Quite literally destroy the home if they can. They hate this paradigm of woman being uniquely tied to home. They hate it. Okay, but at the same time, they're working tirelessly to make women into men, or at least create the illusion, for example, in the institutionalizing of women in combat. Now on the former, well, what they're doing is that they're rotting our culture out. Our culture, they're rotting it. The manifest dysfunctions that all of us see every day of our lives, if we look around, all the broken homes, all the illegitimacy, all the broken kids, all the broken adults, especially since the 1960s and the explosion of divorce and the illegitimacy. This has resulted in the rotting of our culture, the ruining of our lives, who then grow up to procreate, because that's easy and fun, and then who now, as broken adults, produce more broken kids. But by insisting that women are the equal of men in combat, they're now attacking, they're eroding, they're weakening that protective shell that surrounds us, that allows us to have all these absurd debates and do all these terrible things. That after that devastating defeat, we may not be willing to address the reality. The reason we lost is we have feminized the military. And then we'll rebuild, we'll regroup, rearm, but we'll be doing the exact same thing we were doing before. It'll still be feminized. That's the great risk of running. It's one thing for feminism to have devastated tens upon millions of lives and ruined families on a catastrophic scale. It's another thing, but what they're doing in the military is a real and present danger, and it needs to be reversed ASAP, because we've been feminizing the military for decades. We have too many women in the military, and it's a terrible, terrible mix. Putting women in those units, and not just frontline combat units, but in military units generally, at the level that we have, it's a terrible mix. It needs to be a man's world. It must be a man's world. It must be a world that's wholly masculine, and not just masculine, that's wholly alpha male masculine, not beta male, alpha male masculine.
Well, there have always been women in the military, at least as far back as the Union and Confederate armies in our own country. Definitely in World War II, Vietnam, Korea. There were always women in the military, but they were in different roles. So what is the difference, if you will, maybe, between the way women have been utilized in the military in the past versus the way they're doing it now? I guess, I don't know, maybe I'm not asking the question properly.
No, you're asking a non-historian a great question. Women have served their people in one capacity or another since the beginning of time. When in the ancient world, when the people were under attack, the city was under siege, women weren't just sitting on their hands. They did what they could. If they had to, they fought. They were going to defend themselves and defend their children if they had to. All right. Women have always contributed to success what we can. We have to remember we live in a post-industrial society, and that has changed the nature of war quite a bit. It has required mass mobilizations, huge amounts of labor. World War II is a great example of women filling the factories, going to the factories in massive numbers in order to do what the men were doing before, but couldn't do now because they were in the Pacific or in Europe. Okay, so women have always picked up the slack as best they can and always will. All right, they are our last reserve. But institutionalizing women in the military is one thing because there are roles that they can play, support roles. That's one thing. But to institutionalize women in our
even in World War II, there was the WAC, there was the Women's Air Corps.
Sure.
And, they were flying, domestic military flights in the United States or moving supplies to Hawaii or whatever, freeing up the men to fly the combat missions.
Sure. I posit that feminism back then was alive and well. The 1960s didn't happen beginning in 1960. The 1960s was a result of generations of work. The radical feminists had been working towards this goal of eradicating differences between men and women for generations. They wanted women in the military. They wanted examples of women doing military stuff so they can say, look, women can do it. Women are the same. I'll put my head on the chopping block here. All right. I posit that if there was no such thing as whack back in World War II, that we still would have won World War II. I posit that the role that they played was not essential. Now, I'm not saying that what they did was not useful. Of course it was. Every woman that was flying a plane was one man that didn't have to be flying a plane, that could be flying a plane closer to the enemy. There's no question about it. But it wasn't necessary. It wasn't absolutely needful. Must we have men in combat? Of course. That's absolutely needful. Not only must we have men, we must have young men. Not only young men, we must have tough, fighting young men. You have to have that group, period. If you don't have that group, you're almost certainly going to perish. You're going to lose the war. Do you have to have women in combat in order to achieve victory? Absolutely not. If you're to the point where you have to have women in the military, the only thing at that point you surrender and you beg for mercy, because the women are not the second reserve. In a true emergency, which group is the second reserve, the deep reserve in a military crisis for any people? That group is the middle-aged men. Okay, we don't have the toughness or the endurance of the younger men anymore, but it's made up. But we make up for it in an emergency because we're still men, and we still got a lot of our youthful strength left, and we have experience and maturity. So we're the deep reserve. And in a national emergency, if we burn through all the young men, and if we burn through all the middle-aged men, what games are we? You cannot fight a war against men with women, period. So the whack, once again, it's always the exceptions. They always come back to the exceptions. Well, these exceptions are noteworthy and often praiseworthy, except you have to look at feminism's end game. Their end game is to institutionalize women in combat in order to break down really one of the last great barriers that they have to creating this illusion that men and women are the same.
Combat eventually breaks down if it goes south. In other words, you've talked about how, because we can keep our enemies at arm's length, it creates a situation where women can go into combat and, forgive me, I'm going to say it, the weaker sex's weaknesses might not be revealed. But what happens when combat breaks down? What happens when the infantry charge goes bad, or when the plane crashes, or when the troop transport gets hijacked? In other words, what happens when the situation deteriorates to hand-to-hand combat?
Yeah, let's remember there are always exceptions. There are those rare women that go toe-to-toe with 90% of men. They're very rare. And we have to back up and remember that we're talking about institutionalizing women in combat, which means we're going to prepare ahead of time for future conflicts. And by putting large numbers of women in our combat units, let's say I'm picking a number, 15%. Okay. Now, in that circumstance, they are now, you have a 15% weak link. They're the weak link, not just physically, but emotionally. They're just not cut out for it. But they can prosper and appear to succeed as long as you can control the circumstances, as long as you can keep the combat within a certain range of intensity. You know, it's on the one far end. You know, there's I smell gun. You smell the gunpowder, and you hear explosions off in the distance. All right. On the other hand, you've got some wild-eyed mujahideen with his hands wrapped around your throat. You know, and it's just there's a swirling, chaotic melee. You've been awake for 36 hours straight, and you haven't eaten for 48 hours. That's on the far extreme end. Okay. Well, on that far end, the last 20% of it, women simply they're not going to prosper. They're the exceptions. They're the exceptions, but by and large, they're just not going to prosper. And that 15% could become decisive, because here's what has happened throughout history, over and over again, and will always happen. The unexpected will happen. You'll suddenly lose the initiative. You'll suddenly be ambushed, surprised. The enemy will present some new weapon that you weren't prepared for. The Germans, when they gassed the Allies in World War I. I mean, the unexpected always happens. Battle of the Bulge, Chosin Reservoir, Korea. What was the battle in the Tet Offensive in Vietnam? These things always, at some time or another, it breaks down because your enemy is trying to make it break down. He's trying to get one up on you all the time, and every once in a while he succeeds. Mogadishu, 1993. Remember that one? Remember the Black Hawk Down, the movie they made about it? We're doing so because we assume we're always going to have the edge, and we're not. We're going to lose it one day, maybe in my lifetime. You know, certainly in my children's lifetime. We'll fight another war where we'll lose control, and the stakes.
But in addition to all of the other reasons why women in combat just doesn't seem to be working, what do you do with the morale of the men who now have to fight with these women?
Our leftist media has done all it has for generations given feminism cover. It's protected feminism from the hard questions, the questions that it cannot answer. It's helped feminism to produce the illusion that they're trying to produce. What's impossible for them to deflect, for them to argue, is the emotional aspect. Women have a different emotional nature. Men are highly complementary, such as around the supper table, okay, and within the marriage bond, within the home, okay, at a cocktail party with friends. But there's also times when these emotional natures must be, for example, there's women have girl talk. Well, likewise, there is male bonding. The men work together in groups of all men in a way that's different than when they work in mixed groups. Something happens in a group of all men. It's male bonding. It's real. It's decisive. And women are highly corrosive in this environment. They're highly corrosive to male bonding. Imagine a group of friends getting together once the third Friday of every month to play poker and have a few beers. If the host wife walks in, the whole atmosphere changes. Of course it does. And it remains changed until she leaves. All right. Same as if I walk in on my wife when she's visiting with a bunch of her girlfriends. That dynamic changes. The presence of women is highly corrosive to male bonding. And male bonding, this is the bedrock. Morale is the bedrock of victory. It's absolutely needful. Male bonding is absolutely critical.
Also, the respect of our enemies. It's important that your enemy have some kind of a respect for you. And how do our enemies respect us? In fact, I know for a fact that many in the Middle Eastern countries and in the Asian countries, they've made it very known that they have no respect for our military whatsoever. Because how do you respect a country that sends an army of women to fight against you?
Well, I know exactly what you're saying, and you're getting close to a good. Of course, we haven't sent an army of women. We would never dare. We won't send a platoon of women into a hardcore combat situation. Our enemies, they do fear us. If they poke their head out of their hole, we're going to shoot a missile at it. Okay, we can reach them wherever they are. Our diplomatic reach, our military reach has no limit almost. So they do fear us and respect us. And what you're getting at, though, and you're absolutely right, is something very fundamental about human nature. Man fear and respect another man, but I'm still a man. Okay, I haven't been debased. When women attempt to put on the persona of a man, picture the butch woman. It's very common today. The butch woman. It does not inspire fear. It does not inspire respect. It inspires contempt. We're not going to inspire those other men with fear. We're not going to make them want to surrender to us. They'll fight to the death rather than be humiliated. To be beaten by a man is one thing, but to be beaten by a woman, physically beaten by a woman, that's a different thing altogether.
Then there's also the issues of pregnancy and rape and and even I don't know that a combat situation needs the interference or the interruption of even a consensual romance.
Woman is mando. When we're intoxicated or stoned, it affects our judgment. It affects our inhibitions. Women have a similar effect on man. You have a group of friends, and then some honey walks in the room. That changes the dynamic. He is sexually desirable, and now that group of friends become potentially competitors. Okay, they can no longer focus upon some single purpose. They're now thinking about getting laid, getting some sugar. All right, they're now competitors. Maybe getting off your question a little bit, and then there's the issue of women don't always play well together. This will drive feminism insane, but they don't. Woman is, by her nature, is hardwired to look inward to her home. Her home is where she rules. She's the mistress. She's in charge. She does things her way. She's hardwired sexually desirable women as potential competitors for her caveman. They simply don't always work well together. So when you insert women into a combat unit, you create the potential where the men are getting sort of stoned sexually by her presence, and where her presence could negatively impact the other women in the unit who now view her as a competitor for the men's feelings and attention, where all these sexual tensions exist and are going to exist. They've always existed, but it's a terrible, terrible thing to have in a combat unit. He wants them to stay focused during those weeks or months that they're being deployed. But he's got 100 or so heavily armed men that he wants to keep focused. So he controls the dope as he can. He controls the alcohol. He tries to keep it under control so that when they need to be focused, they're focused. Well, you can't have, in the event you're deployed, it hits the fan, you're in the field and you've been there for a day, breaking down. What he doesn't need is that woman out there with his men, with her body, and the effect that it has on his men. He doesn't need them being distracted by the possibility of sex in a high intensity situation. Now, people are going to be joking. I'm not talking about you're getting shot at. Hey, honey, how about let's get it on? No, I'm saying that you're in a combat situation where you are in the field, deployed, facing an enemy. You don't need to share a trench with some honey. The sexual aspect of it is a major reason why we should not have men who suffer from the homosexual inclination in our combat units. There's no place for sex we're in groups of men who are focused on an extremely important task, and there's no task that's more important or where the stakes are higher than combat. You got to eliminate the sex the same way you try to eliminate or control the drugs and alcohol. It only lead to bad.
Toward the end of your book, you talk about how the conservatives have failed to conserve.
What's a conservative? We don't know what a conservative is. Is it Rush Limbaugh? I love Rush Limbaugh. I mean, I grew up on him. He's a hero of mine. But what's a conservative? What is conservatism? I mean, we more or less know what liberalism is, or progressivism, kind of. I mean, it's a worship to one extent or another of the individual, freedom, and equality. Okay, but what are we so-called conservatives trying to conserve? Well, we don't know. We're trying to conserve the America of the 1950s. What are we trying to conserve? We have until we define until we know what it is we're trying to conserve. We're going to keep losing to progressivism. And the reason is because conservatism basically is a branch of progressivism. That is modern American conservatism, whatever that is. We worship the great deities of the Enlightenment, just like the progressives do. I mean, we don't worship equality the way the progressives do, but we do worship freedom. We worship the nation. We worship America. America is our God. I'm a patriot, but I don't think I should worship America until we realize what we need to conserve, what's worth conserving. Well, we're going to continue to lose because we're fighting from the same playbook as the progressives are.
And so do you think that that's why we don't see the opposition to women in combat by, I'll just say it, Republicans or the Trump administration or conservative talk radio hosts or...
Yeah, they play the freedom and equality card. Freedom and equality. I mean, we play the same cards ourselves, both the freedom and equality. We do. So I mean, how can we say we want to be, we want to be equal of other men, and we want to be free to do this and that, and we're going to deny it to others? How do we? Upon what grounds do we say that we ought not? That it's unwise to institutionalize women in combat? Well, what grounds do we have? Well, we don't. There's one thing that is not discussed in the popular media very often. That is human nature. It's like it's fallen off the radar. We don't think about it. We don't talk in terms of what's natural, what's human nature. We can just look at this purely from a human nature point of view, and human nature declares that it is a dumb, dangerous idea. The other approach we can take, you can take if you're a Christian, because that's the competing worldview, the worldview that competes against progressivism. Progressivism rose up in the 1700s and has been competing successfully against the Christian world ever since. All right. Well, if you're a Christian, you can reject the tenets of the Enlightenment and re-embrace Christian worldview wholly, and then attack the idea of institutionalizing women in combat from that point, from that worldview, which incidentally is reconciled very neatly and nicely with human nature.
Well, the Bible itself prohibits women in combat. Moses made that very clear.
Well, the Bible, all the do's and don'ts that God places upon us, it just makes sense. Its do's and don'ts are indeed good for us, as opposed to progressivism. Its do's and don'ts are indeed often bad for us. I mean, we don't have, as Christians, we don't have to abandon reason. As Christians, we can embrace reason. The Bible is perfectly reasonable. Christ's teachings and the teaching of the apostles are reasonable. They make sense. Exercise restraint. Deny yourself. Put other people first. Everything it says about the nature of men and women is right on.
So what motivated you to write this book? What motivated you to tackle this subject?
Oh, great question. Both of my dear parents are still alive, and I have two brothers. I was born in 1966, and so I have to be careful. I love my parents, but I came up in a broken home, and the feminism is directly that this feminist age that I've grown up since the 1960s. The ideology of feminism, they halfway untouchable. Because it's given so much cover by otherwise honest conservative Christian women. It's like the Christian women almost have hired the devil to be their lawyer, almost, to advocate on their behalf.
Well, I've got two words for that. If you're a Southern Baptist, Beth Moore.
That's right.
We'll move on.
What they did to him was a travesty. that man was crucified up on the cross, and he's not. All they did was break the tip of the spear when they broke him. The more were coming just like him.
Well, how does one go about getting a copy of your book?
Oh, I remember your question now. I remember my train of thought. I grew up in a broken home in a feminist age. My troubled youth is a direct result of feminist, and I am doing all I can to take vengeance upon feminism. Your next question was, how do you get my book? Amazon, ebook, and paperback, of course. That's where you get it, Amazon.
Do you have a website?
Right now, no. I mean, maybe I should, but I'm just not really computer literate enough, let's say. So, no, I don't. But my email address is in the book. I'd love to hear from members of your audience.
Okay.
And anything they can do or that you can do to promote it is much appreciated. I'm not doing this for the money. I've got my own business that takes care of me and my family. This is a labor of love and vengeance against an evil idea that is wrecking our culture, rotting our culture out from the inside out, and is now tapping and hammering away at the outer shell that is our military.
Right.
That is feminism. Feminism is public enemy number one. We need to quit giving it a pass. We need to treat these radical feminists the same way, in hindsight, that we should have treated the radical communists in the first decade of the 20th century, the Nazis in the 1920s. These are evil, stupid, dangerous people.
Well, at least my own study of history would lead me to believe that if we were to nip feminism in the bud, we probably should have done it in about the 1870s.
Could not have done it. Feminism could not have done it. Feminism exists because of what the Industrial Revolution has allowed, the immense prosperity, the radical change in the economy. It has allowed both man and woman to live in such a way that our ancestors could not have imagined. It's allowed us to ask questions, make demands that our ancestors could have never asked or made. What's going to destroy feminism eventually is the same thing that's going to destroy progressivism, and that is the inherent irrationalism in it. Any people that embrace progressivism are embracing their eventual destruction. Look at what happened to Russia in the last century. They embraced communism wholeheartedly and suffered a catastrophic events, and it eventually burned itself out. Now Russia is recovering morally, spiritually. It's finally recovering. The longer we embrace feminism, the longer we hold on to these absurd ideas, the more certain our destruction will be. What's going to ruin feminism will be hard times, will be dangerous times. And when dangerous times one day come again, and we once again need women to be women and do what women have always done, and maybe need to be men, for men to be men, feminism will be chucked out the window by the women. But as long as we're all fat and happy, as we are today, everybody's fine to pretend to keep this illusion going. That's why conservatives don't really get worked up about women in combat, because we don't hear any explosions off in the distance. We don't see columns of refugees walking down our interstates. Our hospitals are not overflowing with wounded. We don't have enemy aircraft screaming overhead.
Right.
We're so safe and so sedated in our prosperity that they want to be in combat. Let them. They're Americans. They ought to be free to be in combat. Whatever. Oh yeah.
So where are you at in Italy right now?
We have for this week's TBR Radio presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. I hope that our conversation with Mark Atkins, author of the book Women in Combat, was something. I don't want to say it was enjoyable, because the subject of women in combat, to be quite honest, is not an enjoyable subject from any side of the equation. But if nothing else, hopefully it was educational. And I hope that it caused you to think at least a little bit, regardless of what side of the issue you're on. Hopefully you learned something today. I'd like to encourage you to check out Mark's book. It's a great read. It took me probably 4 or 5 hours to read his book. and it was a great read. Also want to encourage you to go to our website, www.dixieheritage.net. Sign up for our free weekly email newsletter. When you do, I'll also send you a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. So see you next week, and until then, God bless.